Celeste Harrow's voice cut across the ballroom like a blade. "And this," she said, turning to the circle of surgeons and donors, with a smile sharp enough to draw blood, "is Audrey. One of our nurses. Not a nurse. One of the nurses. The kind of introduction you give someone who brings the coffee." Audrey Pembroke stood there in her blue scrubs, under a black coat she hadn't had time to change out of, 12 hours of someone else's emergency still written into the creases around her eyes. And she felt every person in that room do the same thing: glance at her, decide what she was, and look away. She had survived worse than this. What she hadn't survived yet was what happened next. The ballroom went quiet in that particular way that meant someone important had walked in. And when Audrey turned, she saw her husband standing in the doorway. Grayson Thorne, black tuxedo, 12 years older than her. The kind of man who made rooms rearrange themselves without saying a word. Celeste saw him too, and Celeste smiled. "Grayson," she said, moving toward him like she'd been waiting all night. "I don't know if you remember me. I'm Dr. Celeste Harrow. I was part of the team that saved your life 2 years ago." Grayson looked at her, then he looked at Audrey. Something passed across his face that most people in the room would have missed. "That's a strange way," he said quietly, "to describe the woman who saved my life." And he wasn't looking at Celeste when he said it. "Sapleen, if you've ever been dismissed by someone who should have known better, if you've ever watched credit get handed to the person standing closest to the spotlight, while the one who actually did the work stood in the back, then you already understand what this story is about. Stay with me through all 5 parts. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet, because I put out stories like this every week, and I don't want you to miss what's coming. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely want to know how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning, because none of what you just saw makes sense without it. The night Audrey Pembroke saved Grayson Thorne's life, she didn't know his name. She didn't know his empire. She didn't know about the 3 black SUVs that usually surrounded him everywhere he went, or the 12 men who reported directly to him, or the fact that half the people who owed him money would rather break their own hands than be late on a payment. She didn't know any of that. She knew a man named Andrew Hale had been brought in through the ambulance bay at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday in March, that his blood pressure was dropping, and that the cardiology fellow who had just examined him had ordered observation and another ECG in 30 minutes. 30 minutes. Audrey stood at the foot of his bed and looked at the monitor and felt something pull tight in her chest, the way it did sometimes. That specific wrongness that didn't show up on a chart, but that 12 years in an emergency department teaches you to recognize the way you recognize the smell of rain before it starts. His pressure was 94/60 and trending down. His color was wrong. He was sweating in a way that wasn't from pain. And when he shifted in the bed and grabbed the rail, his jaw clenched in a way that told her the pain had just moved. She pulled the curtain back and went to find the attending. Dr. Marcus Webb was at the nursing station with his back to the department, reading something on his phone, and Audrey's said, "The chest pain in Bay 4 Hale. Andrew, I think we need a repeat ECG now, not in 30 minutes. Webb looked up. He was 53 years old and had been practicing emergency medicine for 24 years, and he had the particular tiredness of a man who'd heard too many nurses tell him something was wrong. Harrow just evaluated him. "I know. His pressure's dropped 6 points in 20 minutes and he's diaphoretic." Harrow ordered observation. "I know what she ordered." Audrey kept her voice even. She had learned a long time ago that the moment she let irritation into her voice, men like Webb stopped hearing the words and started hearing the tone. "I'm telling you what I'm seeing. His presentation is changing." Webb looked at her for a moment. "Get the repeat ECG," he said. "But if it's the same, we follow Harrow's protocol." "Thank you." She went back to the bay. Grayson Andrew Hale was watching the ceiling when she returned. He turned his head when she came in, and she noticed that his eyes were sharp in a way that contradicted everything else about his physical state. Most patients in acute distress get a particular unfocused look, like they've retreated somewhere inside themselves. This man was watching her. Someone watches a room they need to map. "Another test?" he said. "Yes. The other doctor said I was fine. She said you were stable enough for monitoring." "That's different from fine." Audrey was already attaching the leads, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done this exact sequence 10,000 times. "How's the pain right now?" A pause. Worse. Where? Started in the center. Now he stopped. Left arm? He looked at her. Both, he said. She finished the ECG, printed it, and carried it to Webb herself instead of sending it through the system. She didn't wait for him to finish what he was doing. She put it in his line of sight and said, "Look at V4. Webb looked, and she watched his expression change. What happened next was organized chaos, the particular controlled emergency of a department that knows what it's doing. Webb called the cardiology attending. Audrey increased Grayson's oxygen and went back to his bay. She checked his pressure again, 88/58, and pushed the crash cart to within 6 feet of his bed, close enough to matter, far enough not to alarm him, unnecessarily. Though when she looked at him, she suspected he wasn't a man who alarmed easily. He watched her move the cart. "That's not great, is it?" he said. It wasn't a question. "We're being careful. I've been lied to by professionals before." His voice was still steady, which she found unusual. Most people, when they understand they might be dying, either go very quiet or go the other direction. He was just present, assessing. "What does the test show?" She looked at him. She made a decision. "It shows that I was right to repeat it," she said, "and that we needed to start moving faster than we were." He was quiet for a moment. "What's your name?" "Audrey." "Audrey." He said it like he was filing it somewhere. "Are you going to stay?" "I'm not going anywhere." The cardiology attending arrived 4 minutes later. Things accelerated. There was a moment in the middle of the organized emergency when Grayson's hand came out from under the sheet and wrapped around her wrist, not desperate, not panicked, just deliberate, and he said, "Don't leave." And she said, "I won't." And she didn't. She stayed until they had him stable. She documented everything. She went home at 3 a.m., slept 5 hours, and went back for another shift. She did not think about him as anything other than a patient she'd helped save, because that was the job. And she was good at her job, and she had learned a long time ago not to attach her sense of self-worth to outcomes, only to the decisions that led to them. She could not have known that she had already made the most consequential decision of her life. He came back 3 weeks later. She didn't recognize him. At first, he was upright, well-dressed, and carrying coffee, which was not how most of her patients revisited her, but something about the way he stood in the doorway of the department made her look twice. "You're not supposed to be back here," she said. "I know." He held out one of the cups. "I asked at the desk. They said you were on shift." She looked at the coffee. She looked at him. "You could have sent flowers. Normal people send flowers. I don't do flowers." She didn't take the coffee immediately. "Mr. Hale, that's not my name." She stopped. He said it without drama, without apology. Just stated it the way you state a fact. And she felt the first small shift of something she couldn't name, not suspicion exactly, more like the awareness that a conversation had just changed lanes without signaling. "Okay," she said slowly. "What is your name?" "Grayson Thorne." She'd heard the name. She didn't live in a hole. But knowing a name is not the same as knowing what it means. And in that moment, standing in the corridor of the emergency department in her scrubs, she didn't fully understand what Grayson Thorne meant. She would learn. "Okay, Mr. Thorne Grayson. I'm at work." "I know. I'll be brief." He finally lowered the coffee he'd been holding toward her, an offering that had been patient long enough. "I wanted to thank you. Not with flowers, with something real." She took the coffee. She listened. He was careful with what he said. That first day he didn't tell her about the organization. Not that time, not even close, but he was oddly direct about everything else. He told her he'd spent the week since his discharge thinking about the moment she'd put the ECG in front of the attending, and said, "Look at V4, and how he'd recognized something in that moment that he encountered rarely, someone willing to be right in a room full of people who'd already decided she was wrong." He said that quietly. She heard it. "You don't know you were right until you're right," she said. "Could have been wrong. Would have been embarrassing. But you'd have survived the embarrassment." "Yes. And I might not have survived the silence." She was quiet. "I know," she said. He nodded. He drank his coffee. He asked if she had time to talk, and she said she had 7 minutes before she was needed, and they talked for 7 minutes, and then she went back to work, and he left, and she thought that was the end of it. It wasn't the end of it. He came back the following week, and the week after that. Not always to the hospital. She was clear that the hospital was her territory, and she had rules there, but eventually to the coffee shop down the street, and then to the diner on 9th, and then slowly to conversations that stopped having a natural endpoint. He was guarded in particular ways and oddly open in others. He didn't talk about his work in any specific terms for a long time. She noticed he never checked his phone while they were talking, which she later understood meant he'd left it with someone. She noticed he never sat with his back to a door. She noticed that once, when a man she didn't recognize sat down 3 tables away, Grayson's entire posture changed in a way so small she almost missed it, and he said, "I need to go," and was gone in under 30 seconds. She wasn't naive. She was, in fact, the opposite of naive. 12 years in an emergency room had given her a finely calibrated alarm system for when something wasn't adding up, and things with Grayson Thorne didn't always add up. She asked him directly one night. They were at the diner. It was late, after her shift, and she was eating a grilled cheese sandwich. She didn't have the energy to upgrade to a real meal. And she said, "What do you actually do, Grayson?" He looked at her. She said, "Not the real estate company. Not the shipping. The part that means you can't sit with your back to a door." A long pause. He put his coffee cup down. He told her, "Not everything, not all at once, but enough." He told her about the organization, about what it controlled and how, about the world he'd been born into and had spent his adult life running. He was clinical about it, in a way she found oddly respectful, like he had decided she deserved the truth, and the truth deserved to be stated plainly. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you asked. A lot of people ask things they don't actually want answered. You're not one of those people." She thought about that. She ate the last corner of her sandwich. "You're right that I'm not." She looked at him. "I need some time to think about what you just told me. Okay? I'm not saying no to anything. I don't even know what I'd be saying no to. I'm saying I need to think. I know what you're saying." She pushed back from the table. She picked up her coat. She stood there for a moment, looking at him across the diner table. This man who had walked back into her department with coffee and a real name and a world that functioned on entirely different rules than the one she operated in. "You were in my emergency room," she said. "You were my patient. You were a person who needed help, and I helped you, because that's the job. What I did that night wasn't about you specifically. I know that. I want to make sure you know that before whatever this becomes." He held her gaze. "I know exactly who you are, Audrey. That's why I came back." She left, she thought, for 2 weeks. She came back. Whatever it was became something else, and then something else after that. And then one evening, she was standing in his apartment, not the largest of the apartments he owned, but the one he actually lived in, which was different. And she understood without any particular ceremony that she had fallen in love with him. Not the empire, not the money, not the particular gravity he carried in a room. The man who ordered the same coffee every time. The man who listened without interrupting. The man who, when she told him about a patient, she'd lost a 31-year-old father, cardiac arrest, 12 minutes of CPR, and it hadn't mattered, had not tried to say anything useful, had just sat with her in the specific silence of someone who understood that sometimes there was nothing to say. She loved that man. She was deeply separately clear-eyed about what surrounded that man. They talked about it, honestly. She would not pretend the organization didn't exist. She would not ask him to lie to her. She would not be kept ignorant for her own because she had seen enough of what happened to women, kept ignorant for their own protection. And she had conditions. The most important one was this. Inside Blackwood Medical Center, she was Audrey Pembroke, emergency nurse. No bodyguards in the waiting room. No donations made on her behalf. No phone calls to hospital executives. No special treatment of any kind, ever, for any reason. She had spent 12 years building a reputation in that building on nothing but her own competence, and she was not going to allow his name or his money to become the explanation for who she was. "If you do that," she said, "you take away the only thing I know for certain is mine." He had looked at her for a long moment. "Agreed," he said. They were married at the courthouse 6 months later. Small ceremony. 2 witnesses. She wore a dress she'd bought at a normal store. He wore a suit he'd had made at a place where suits cost more than her rent. She kept wearing her wedding ring on a chain under her scrubs. She kept her name, and for 6 months, everything held. The night of the Blackwood Medical Foundation Gala, Audrey came directly from a 12-hour shift. She had considered not going. She had, in fact, told Grayson she'd probably skip it. He had said nothing, which was his way of making clear he thought she should come without saying it, because he had learned slowly, with occasional friction, that telling her what to do was the fastest possible way to ensure she did the opposite. She changed her shoes in the cab. She kept the scrubs. The coat covered most of it. Celeste Harrow was the third person she saw when she walked in, which was approximately 2 more sightings than she'd hoped for. Celeste had been a cardiology fellow 2 years ago. She was now, apparently, a full attending, and apparently also the kind of person who attended foundation galas and worked the room like she was interviewing for a better life. She was in a red gown. Her hair was perfect. A sound standing. She was a cluster of department heads and donors, and she saw Audrey at the same moment Audrey saw her, and she smiled the way people smile when they see something they've been looking forward to. Audrey, she came over, unhurried, confident. I didn't expect to see you here. I wasn't planning to come, Audrey said. Celeste looked at the coat. She looked at what was visible below the coat. Did you come from the hospital? Just got off. Ah. Celeste said it pleasantly, but Audrey heard the whole sentence underneath it. Of course you did. Because this is who you are, because this is your ceiling. She should have walked away. She knew she should have walked away. She had gotten very good over years at recognizing the exits in a room before Celeste could close them. But Celeste moved first. Come meet some people, she said, and her hand was already on Audrey's elbow, steering her with the particular force of someone who makes steering look like hospitality. The group she'd been talking to turned. Audrey recognized one of the surgeons, 2 of the board members, and a man she didn't know who had the particular stillness of someone with a lot of money. This is Audrey, Celeste said warmly. She works at Blackwood. One of our nurses. The way she said it, one of our nurses. The man with the stillness looked at Audrey, and Audrey understood, in the way she understood when a monitor changed and something was about to happen, that this moment was about to change. Actually, Celeste continued, building momentum now. Audrey and I worked on a very interesting case together a couple of years ago. A significant cardiac emergency. I was the fellow on call. I just evaluated the patient, had him stabilized for monitoring, and then I was called back because his condition had escalated. She paused for the appropriate beat. Remarkably complex case. The attending and I managed to get him through it. A gracious, modest smile. I actually consider it one of the more meaningful saves of my early career. Audrey said nothing. She was very good at saying nothing. Celeste looked at her with the particular satisfaction of someone who has just taken something and is waiting to see if the other person noticed. You were on that shift too, weren't you, Audrey? I was, Audrey said. Do you remember it? Very well. The ballroom shifted. Not physically. But something changed in the atmosphere the way it changes before weather arrives. And Audrey became aware, before she turned, that someone had entered the room. She turned anyway. Grayson stood in the doorway. Their eyes met. His expression was very still in the way it got when he was reading a room and deciding what it needed. Then Celeste saw him. Oh, she said, and her voice changed, elevated, energized, and she was moving before Audrey had taken another breath. Grayson, I'm so glad you could make it. He looked at her, polite, unreadable. Dr. Harrow. She laughed lightly. You do remember. I wasn't sure it was a complicated night. She touched his arm briefly. The particular touch of someone claiming a connection in public. I was just telling some colleagues about your case. About what the team managed to pull off that night. I consider it one of my another modest smile. I'm just glad you made it through. Grayson looked at her. Then he looked past her. He looked at Audrey, standing slightly behind, and to the left of Celeste in scrubs and a coat, 12 hours of someone else's emergency still written on her face. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. He looked back at Celeste. That's a strange way, he said, quietly and precisely, to describe the woman who saved my life. He was not looking at Celeste when he said it. The circle of doctors and donors went still. Celeste turned. She looked at Audrey. She looked back at Grayson. Her mouth opened, closed. The red of her dress suddenly seemed too bright for what her face was doing. I'm sorry, she managed. Your nurse, Grayson said. And now he did look at Celeste, and there was nothing impolite in his voice, nothing raised, nothing that would make someone watching from across the room understand what was happening. The one you just introduced. She's the reason I'm standing in this room. A pause. She recognized my deterioration before anyone else did, he continued. She repeated my ECG without permission. She moved the crash cart to my bay before anyone else thought it was necessary. She stayed with me when everyone else was moving. He picked up a glass from a passing tray, without looking for it, the way people do when they've spent a lifetime, knowing things will be in reach. She saved my life, he said. Not the team, her. Celeste Harrow stood very still in her red gown, in the middle of the Blackwood Medical Foundation gala. And for the first time in longer than Audrey could remember, she didn't have a single thing to say. Audrey looked at Grayson. He looked at her. Neither of them said anything else. But around them, the circle had shifted the way rooms shift, when the ground underneath them has changed, and everyone in it was now trying to understand who, exactly, the woman in the scrubs was. They didn't know yet. They were about to find out. The circle of people around them took approximately 4 seconds to remember how to breathe. Audrey counted them without meaning to old habit. The way you count seconds between a patient's chest compressions to make sure the rhythm is right. 4 seconds of total silence. And then the surgeon to her left cleared his throat, and the donor with the still face looked down at his drink, and Celeste Harrow made a sound that was almost a laugh, except that nothing about her face was laughing. Well, Celeste said. That's very generous of you to say. I'm not being generous, Grayson said. I'm being accurate. Another second. Celeste looked at Audrey, the way someone looks at a thing they've underestimated and are now recalculating. It wasn't embarrassment exactly. It was closer to the particular cold anger of someone who has just realized they walked into a room without knowing the full layout. Audrey didn't say anything. She had learned slowly over years through a lot of situations that required it, that silence was a tool as precise as any other, and that the person who spoke first after a shift in power usually did so at a cost. Celeste spoke first. Of course, she said, pivoting with the smoothness of someone who had spent a career managing rooms. The entire team that night deserves credit. Emergency medicine is collaborative by nature. She smiled at the surgeon beside her. I'm sure Dr. Harrington would agree. Harrington, to his credit, said nothing. Grayson set his glass down on a passing tray. I remember the night clearly, he said. I was conscious for most of it. I remember who stayed. That was all he said. He moved to stand beside Audrey. Not in front of her, he understood that particular distinction, had learned it with friction, and Audrey felt the warmth of him at her shoulder and also felt the very specific tension of a man exercising enormous restraint. She touched his arm once briefly, her fingers at his elbow. A signal. He felt it. His posture didn't change, but something in it released, fractionally. The cluster around them had the awkward quality of witnesses to an accident, people who weren't sure whether to stay or go, whether what they'd seen was as significant as it felt. One of the board members, Harriet Lowe, 60, hair silver and precise, the woman who chaired the Foundation's ethics committee, looked between Celeste and Audrey with an expression Audrey couldn't fully read. Then she said, to no one in particular, I think I need another drink. And the circle broke apart with the quiet relief of people who'd been given permission to leave. Celeste left last. She didn't rush. She wouldn't rush. But when she turned, she looked at Audrey once more, just once, just briefly, and in that look was the entire architecture of what was coming. Audrey recognized it. She'd seen it before, in different faces, in different rooms. It was the look of someone deciding they had nothing left to lose by going further. She filed it away. The ride home was quiet. Grayson sat beside her in the back of the car, not one of the black convoy vehicles he used for organizational business, just a car, a driver named Paul who'd worked for him for 11 years, and who had the particular discretion of someone who'd heard everything and remembered nothing, and he looked out the window for 4 blocks before he said anything. She altered the story completely. Yes, in front of a room full of people. I noticed. He turned from the window. How long has she been doing that? Audrey pressed her fingers against the bridge of her nose. She was tired in the specific way that only came from a 12-hour shift, followed by 45 minutes of social performance. Her feet hurt. Her left shoulder, which she'd tweaked moving a patient 6 weeks ago, and which hadn't fully healed, was aching. I don't know that tonight was the first time she's told that version, she said. I know it's the first time she told it in front of me. That's not an accident. No, Audrey agreed. It's not. Grayson was quiet. She could feel him being quiet, in the particular way he got quiet, when he was deciding how much of what he was thinking to say out loud, which was a habit she'd come to recognize, and which she respected even when it frustrated her. "I can find out what she's been saying," he said. "Who she's told. Whether it's affected anything formally." "Don't, Audrey, I mean it, don't." She turned to look at him. "The second your people start asking questions about Celeste Harrow, it stops being about what she did and starts being about who my husband is. Those are two completely different problems." He held her gaze. "You're not wrong," he said. "I know I'm not wrong." A pause. "That doesn't make it easier to sit with. I know that too." She looked out her own window. The city moved past, indifferent the way cities are at midnight, lit up and busy, and utterly uninterested in the specific small disasters of the people moving through it. "I documented everything that night," she said. "Every decision I made. Every time. Everything I observed. It's in the record. Then the record will show it." She didn't answer immediately. She was thinking about something she hadn't said yet, something she'd been carrying since she'd gotten into the cab outside the hospital. Since before the gala, since the particular unease that had started, if she was honest, a few weeks ago, when a colleague had mentioned offhandedly that Celeste Harrow had given a lecture at Grand Rounds about a complex cardiac, save she'd managed during her fellowship. Audrey had not been mentioned. She had noted it. She had set it aside. She had told herself it was probably a simplification for presentation purposes, the way case presentations always simplified, and that it didn't necessarily mean anything. Now she was less certain. "I want to look at the record," she said. "Tonight. Tomorrow." The hospital's medical record system was not something an emergency nurse could access from home for any chart outside an active patient interaction that was a privacy protection correctly applied, but Audrey knew people in health information management the way anyone knew people after 12 years in the same building. She also knew the specific process for requesting access to records in which she was a documented care provider. She submitted the request at 7:42 a.m. the following morning. She got the response at 11:15 a.m. She sat in her car in the parking structure across from the hospital and looked at her phone for a long time after she read it. The record existed. Of course it existed. She'd known the chart was there. She'd been part of creating it. But what she was reading now, on the summary access screen, was a version of events that felt like a photograph of a room she'd been in, taken from an angle that made it look like a completely different room. Celeste Harrow's note, filed at 12:41 a.m. on the night in question, described her initial evaluation comprehensively. It described her reasoning for the monitoring order. It described her return to the patient when the situation escalated. It described, in precise clinical language, the role of the cardiology fellow in coordinating the emergency response that followed. Audrey's nursing note, the one she had filed at 11:52 p.m., before the second ECG, in which she had documented her clinical observations, the change in Grayson's presentation, her decision to escalate, and her conversation with Dr. Webb was not visible in the summary. She clicked through to the full chart. She found the note. It was there, but it had been amended. The term in the system was modified, with an edit timestamp of 4:17 a.m., 3.5 hours after the events it described. The original text was partially preserved, as required by law. But what had been added in the amendment, written in clinical language so careful and neutral it almost didn't read as what it was, repositioned the sequence. The language described Audrey's escalation as following Dr. Harrow's reassessment rather than preceding it. Before Celeste. Before. That was the entire point. That was the thing she'd staked her professional reputation on in that room, the thing she'd felt in her hands and her gut and 12 years of trained instinct before anyone else saw it. And it was gone. Audrey sat in her car. She breathed. She was not someone who cried easily. She'd made a particular peace with that, about herself, a long time ago. But her hands were not entirely steady when she put her phone down on the passenger seat. She picked it up again. She called Grayson. He answered on the second ring. She modified the record, Audrey said. A pause. One beat, then two. When Grayson spoke, his voice was level in the specific way that meant the opposite of level. When 3-something a.m., night of the event. After her shift. Can she do that? Is that nurses and physicians can amend records? There are legitimate reasons to do it. There are very specific circumstances where it's appropriate. She heard herself being clinical about it and was grateful for the clinical. This isn't one of them. What she did repositioned the clinical sequence. It makes it look like I escalated after she identified the problem instead of before. Silence, Audrey, his voice had changed. Let me know. I wasn't going to say what you think I was going to say. Then what were you going to say? A pause. I was going to say I'm sorry. That's all, she exhaled. Okay, she said. I know. What are you going to do? She looked out through the windshield at the parking structure's concrete ceiling. There was a water stain up there she'd never noticed before. Gray-brown, spreading from a crack, shaped like nothing. I'm going to request a formal clinical integrity review, she said, through the proper channels. I'm going to document what I found, how I found it, and what the audit trail shows. And if the audit trail doesn't show it clearly enough, then I build a different case. She picked up her bag. Grayson, every piece of equipment in that emergency department runs on timestamps. The oxygen adjustment I made, the card I moved, the second ECG request I submitted. The system didn't just record what people wrote, it recorded what the machines did. You can alter a note. You cannot make the cardiac monitor forget that it printed a new strip at 11:54 p.m. before anyone else ordered one. A long beat. I love you, he said. I know. She got out of the car. I'll call you tonight. She filed the review request at 1:30 p.m. through the hospital's Clinical Quality and Safety Office using the standard incident disclosure pathway, which was designed specifically to allow care providers to flag concerns about medical record accuracy without immediate disciplinary implication for anyone involved. It was the correct process. She knew it was the correct process. She had used it once before, years ago, for a different situation entirely, and it had worked the way it was supposed to work. By 0 p.m., Dr. William Farrow, the chief medical officer, had been notified. By 3:45 p.m., Celeste Harrow had been notified. By 5:20 p.m., Audrey received a call from the hospital's legal department. The woman on the phone was polite, professional. She had the careful voice of someone who had been briefed to be careful. She said that in response to Audrey's request for a clinical integrity review, the hospital was required to conduct a preliminary evaluation. She said that during this preliminary evaluation, access to related records would need to be considered. She said that they appreciated Audrey's diligence and commitment to accuracy. Audrey said, "What does that mean for my current duties?" A pause. "We'd like to ask you to avoid accessing Mr. Hale's archive chart until the preliminary evaluation is complete. I've already accessed it through the official request process. We understand. Going forward during the evaluation." Understood. Audrey kept her voice neutral. "Is there anything else?" Another pause. Longer this time. "Dr. Harrow has also raised some concerns," the woman said carefully, "that we'll need to address as part of the preliminary process. We'll be reaching out to schedule a time to speak with you." "What concerns?" "We'll cover that when we meet. I'd like to know now." A breath on the line. "Dr. Harrow has indicated that she has questions about the circumstances under which you access the chart and the nature of your relationship to the patient. She's suggested that the motivation for the access request may not be purely professional." The temperature in Audrey's chest dropped about 10 degrees. She knew exactly what that sentence meant. She knew what Celeste was building. "I see," Audrey said. "We'll schedule a meeting for early next week." "Dr. Harrow is suggesting," Audrey said, "that I have a personal relationship with the patient and that my record access was motivated by that relationship rather than clinical concern." A pause that confirmed she was correct. "We'll discuss it when we meet." Audrey said goodbye and hung up and stood in the middle of the hospital corridor and let herself feel, for about 15 seconds, the specific cold fury of someone who has just watched a situation she handled correctly get turned into the evidence against her. 15 seconds. Then she started walking. Celeste was still in the building. Audrey had checked before making her call old habit, situational awareness. Know who's in your department before you need to know. She found her in the cardiology unit's charting room, alone, looking at a monitor with the focused expression of someone who had known this was coming. Audrey came in and closed the door. Celeste looked up. She didn't look surprised. "I figured you'd come," she said. "You filed a counter-complaint. I raised concerns." Celeste turned in her chair, facing her fully. "There's a difference." "Is there, Audrey?" Celeste's voice was the particular steady of someone who had prepared this conversation in advance. You went after a record from 2 years ago, the day after your, whatever he is, publicly inserted himself into a story that had nothing to do with him. The story is about the night he nearly died. The story is about a complex cardiac case that I managed as the fellow on call. You were part of the team, but you were the nurse. And I'm sorry if that's... Say that sentence again, Audrey said. Finish it. Celeste stopped. Say what you were about to say, Audrey repeated. I want to hear you say it out loud. Celeste looked at her for a moment, and Audrey saw something cross her face that was almost honesty, a flash of awareness of what she was doing and who she was doing it to, and then it was gone, covered over by everything that had calcified around it. You're a nurse, Audrey. That's not an insult, but it's a different role. I know what my role is. I also know what I did, and I know what you changed. Audrey kept her voice flat, not raised, not shaking, flat and precise. You modified a record to reposition a clinical sequence in your favor. That's not a gray area. That's not interpretation. That's falsification. I amended a note with additional context. You changed the timeline, and I had every right to amend. At 4 a.m, 3 hours after the shift, you changed the timeline. Audrey took one step closer, not threatening, just close enough that Celeste had to hold her ground. I was ahead of you that night. My second ECG was printed before you came back to that bay. The equipment records every timestamp. You can change what the note says. You cannot change what the machines did. Something shifted in Celeste's expression. A tightening. Who told you about the timestamps, she said. And the way she said it, the specific alarm in it, told Audrey exactly what she needed to know. Celeste hadn't thought about the equipment timestamps. She had thought about the note. She had not thought about the oxygen administration record, the crash cart location log, the ECG print time stamp. She had modified the only thing she could see and had not considered what she couldn't see. Audrey filed that information and said nothing. This is going to go very badly for you, Celeste said. Her voice had shifted. The prepared conversation quality was gone, replaced by something rawer and more dangerous. When they find out who he is to you, they're going to question everything you've ever done in this department. They're going to wonder if you've been using your access in ways that minus. My access to what? Patient records. Confidential information. I have never accessed a patient record outside of my clinical duties. That's going to be very hard to prove once people start asking. The room was very quiet. Audrey looked at her. This woman she had known for 2 years, had disagreed with professionally, had navigated around with the careful attention you give to something you don't entirely trust. She'd never disliked her exactly. She had recognized her the particular type, the person for whom proximity to credit was more important than the substance of what created it. But this was something different. You need to think carefully, Audrey said, about what you're doing. I could say the same to you. I filed a clinical integrity review based on documented evidence of record modification. That's the correct process. Audrey picked up her bag. What you're doing is trying to build a character problem around me before the process can look at the substance. That's not the same thing. Grayson Thorne. Celeste said the name like she was testing the weight of it. You know what he is. You know what people say about him. I know exactly who he is. Then you know what it looks like. An emergency nurse who marries, if that's even what you are, a man like that. Who then goes after medical records 2 years later? Who claims credit in a case that I saved his life before I knew his name? The words landed in the room and stayed there. Celeste opened her mouth, closed it. He was admitted as Andrew Hale, Audrey said. I didn't know who Grayson Thorne was. I didn't know what he owned or what he ran or what his name meant to anyone. I treated a man named Andrew Hale who was deteriorating and whose escalation I correctly identified ahead of the treating fellow's scheduled reassessment. The record shows that. The equipment shows that. And no amount of what you're building right now changes the sequence. She walked to the door. You should also know, she said, without turning around, that I've already requested the full audit trail, including access logs, including every record of who opened this chart and when. She heard Celeste's chair move. She didn't turn around. She pushed through the door and walked down the corridor and kept walking until she reached the stairwell, where she stopped and put her back against the wall and stood there, breathing for a moment in the particular way you breathe when you're keeping something contained. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. It was a formal notification from the hospital's Human Resources Office, effective immediately, pending the outcome of the preliminary review of concerns raised by Dr. C. Harrow. Nurse Pembroke's active access credentials for clinical areas were suspended. Her badge would not open the emergency department doors. She read it twice. She did not move for a full minute. Then she called Grayson. He answered immediately, the way he always did. She said, "They suspended my access." A silence so complete she could hear him breathing. "I'm coming, no." She closed her eyes. "No, you're not coming. You're not doing anything. Do you hear me?" Audrey. Grayson. Her voice broke, just at the edge, and she let it break for 1 second and then pulled it back. "I need you to listen to me. If you get involved, if you make a single phone call, send a single person, say a single word to anyone at this hospital, it becomes about you. And the second it becomes about you, I lose. Because nobody will ever know if I was right. They'll just know that my husband scared them into backing down." The silence was different now. It was the silence of someone sitting very still with something very difficult. "I know," he said finally. His voice was rough. "There's going to be a hearing. They'll have to hold one." She pushed off the wall, stood up straight. "I need you to come to it. I need you to be there as my witness. Not as Grayson Thorne. As the patient, as Andrew Hale. As the man who was in that bed." Another pause. "Whatever you need." She stood in the stairwell, badge in her hand, the badge that would not open the doors she had walked through for 12 years. And she felt the full weight of it, not despair, not defeat, something harder and colder and more specific than either of those. The morning she had saved him, she had repeated an ECG without permission because the silence of not acting was worse than the cost of being wrong. She was about to do that again. At a much larger scale, with much higher stakes, and with one hand she refused to use tied behind her back because using it would make the victory mean nothing, and she needed this victory to mean something, to herself if to no one else, because there were 12 years of herself in those doors, and she was not going to let Celeste Harrow write a different ending to the story of who she was. She put the badge in her pocket. She walked down the stairs. Outside the city was doing what it always did, moving and indifferent, and full of people with their own specific disasters, and Audrey Pembroke walked through it with her hands steady and her jaw set, and the absolute certainty of someone who knows they were right and has decided that being right is going to have to be enough to build on. The walk from the stairwell to the parking structure took 4 minutes. Audrey knew because she counted. The way she counted everything, not obsessively, not anxiously, but with the particular groundedness of someone who had learned that numbers didn't lie when people did. 4 minutes across the hospital's main corridor, through the lobby where the volunteer at the information desk looked up and smiled at her the way he always did. Past the coffee cart, where she'd bought approximately 300 cups of mediocre drip coffee over the past 12 years, and out through the glass doors into the cold. She didn't look back at the building. She had learned a long time ago that looking back was a specific kind of indulgence, and she wasn't in the business of indulgences right now. She drove home. She changed out of her scrubs. She sat at the kitchen table with her laptop and a legal pad, and she started building. Not a case exactly, not yet. What she was building first was a timeline, everything she could reconstruct from memory, cross-referenced with every legitimate record access she'd made that day, every timestamp she could verify from her own system to activity, every name and sequence and decision from the night 2 years ago that she still carried with the specific clarity of things that mattered. She wrote for 3 hours. At 9 p.m., Grayson came home. He came in quietly. He was always quiet when he was managing something, a sound like green wood splitting when there was something large sitting in him that he was holding carefully, and he put his keys on the counter and looked at the legal pad and the laptop and the cold cup of tea she hadn't touched and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Have you eaten?" No. He went to the kitchen. She heard him moving around, the particular sounds of him navigating a space he knew well, and she kept writing. And 20 minutes later, there was a plate beside her laptop, eggs, toast, nothing ambitious, but warm, and he sat down across from her with his own plate and didn't ask about the legal pad. She ate. He ate. After a while, she said, "I'm going to need the hospital's audit trail records. The full system log of every access made to that chart from the night of admission through the present. Can you get those through the review process? I can request them. Whether the hospital's legal team moves fast enough to preserve them before anyone has reason to think about preserving them. She stopped. Set her fork down. That's the part I'm thinking about. Someone could expedite that. Someone could. Not you. He looked at her. Not frustrated, he had moved past. Frustrated into something quieter and harder that she recognized as the place he went when he was genuinely worried. There's a health information attorney I've worked with. Legitimate practice. Nothing connected to the organization. Is she actually good, or is she good? Because people are afraid of who recommended her. The corner of his mouth moved. Both. But primarily the first. Name, Dana Reeves. She's handled hospital record litigation. Real record litigation, not send me her number. Audrey picked up her fork again. I'll call her myself. In the morning, no introduction from you. She won't know who you are. Good. Then she'll take the case, on the merits. He was quiet for a moment. She watched him process the particular discipline of this, of sitting across from a problem he had the tools to solve and being told specifically not to use those tools, and she watched him choose, again, for the 100th time in the past 24 hours, to honor what she needed over what he wanted to do. She loved him for it. She also knew it was costing him. Grayson. She waited until he looked at her. I know what this is like for you. I know this isn't how you solve problems. It's not. I need it to be how we solve this one. He held her gaze. Something in him was very still. I know, he said. I know that. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. Neither of them said anything else. Dana Reeves had an office on the 14th floor of a building on Lexington, which smelled like good carpet and old paper, and the particular competence of a firm that didn't need to impress anyone. She was 51 small, with close cropped gray hair and the direct, unhurried manner of someone who had spent 3 decades in rooms where people lied to her and had gotten very good at knowing when they were doing it. She listened to Audrey for 22 minutes, without interrupting. When Audrey finished, Reeves said, the amendment timestamp, 4:17 a.m., and Harrow's shift ended at. She was a fellow at the time. Fellows were logging 12 to 14-hour shifts. She came on at 2 p.m. The shift likely ran until 2 or 3 in the morning, possibly later given the emergency. So she amended the record within an hour of her shift ending. At minimum, Reeves wrote something on her own legal pad. And you're saying the amendment repositioned your escalation as following her reassessment rather than preceding it? Yes. Which is the entire clinical question. Audrey confirmed. Reeves tapped her pen against the pad once. The equipment logs. Every piece of hardware in the ED runs on the hospital's network. The cardiac monitor, the oxygen flow regulators, the crash cart. There's a movement sensor on those for tracking the ECG machine itself. Every activation is logged with a timestamp. You can amend a nursing note. You cannot make the ECG machine forget that it printed a strip at a specific time. Reeves looked at her steadily. Why didn't you go after the equipment logs yourself? Because I don't have standing to compel the hospital to produce them outside of a formal process. And the formal process is the review I've already requested, which the hospital is now managing on its own timeline. Yes. Which may or may not move quickly enough to prevent anyone from. Reeves stopped. Changed her phrasing. The equipment logs are system records. They're part of the network infrastructure. They don't get casually altered, but they can be cycled out of short-term storage if nobody flags them for retention. Audrey looked at her. How quickly, she said. Depends on the hospital's data retention policy. For network activity logs, not clinical records, just system activity, some institutions cycle at 90 days. Some at 30, Audrey did the math. It's been 2 years, she said. The clinical record is permanent. The ECG strip is part of the clinical record that's retained. Reeves held her gaze. The ancillary equipment logs the oxygen flow, the cart sensor, the system activity surrounding the ECG request. Those might be a different category. It depends on how the hospital classifies them and what their infrastructure team does, routinely. A long silence. Tell me they're still there, Audrey said. I don't know if they're still there, Reeves said honestly. That's the first thing we need to find out. And we need to find out before anyone at that hospital thinks about whether we're going to ask. Reeves filed an emergency evidence preservation notice with the hospital's legal department at 2:30 p.m. that day, a formal legal demand that all records, digital and physical, related to the admission of Andrew Hale in the specified time frame, be preserved immediately and without alteration. The hospital acknowledged receipt at 4:07 p.m. At 6:52 p.m., Audrey's phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize. She answered anyway. "Miss Pembroke." The voice was male, middle-aged, careful. "My name is Robert Cho. I'm a health information technician at Blackwood Medical. I'm calling. I need to be very clear that I'm not calling in any official capacity." Audrey was already sitting up straight. "Okay. I received the preservation notice this afternoon. I work in data infrastructure. It's my team that manages the network activity logs for the clinical systems." She waited. "The logs you'll be asking about," Cho said. "The ancillary equipment activity for the ED, from the time frame you specified." "Yes." A pause. "They're there," he said. "They were classified under clinical support infrastructure, which means they fall under the permanent retention policy, not the 90-day cycle. They weren't going anywhere." She exhaled. One long, controlled breath. "Thank you. I'm not. I want to be clear, I'm not doing this for any reason, except that I've been in this department for 8 years and I know what those logs show. And I know what the right thing is." He stopped. "Someone tried to pull the access record on that chart today, before the preservation notice came through." She went very still. "Who?" "I can't tell you that officially. What I can tell you is that the access was flagged automatically by our system because the chart has now been marked as part of an active review. The flag went to my supervisor." "Does your supervisor know you're calling me?" "No, Mr. Cho. I know what I'm doing," he said quietly. "I know the risk I'm taking. But I've watched people rewrite things in this building before, and nobody said anything, and this time somebody filed a formal complaint and did everything correctly, and I'm not going to." He stopped again. "The logs are there. When the review requests them formally, they'll be produced." "Thank you," she said. "I mean that. Don't thank me. Just win." He hung up. She sat very still. Someone had tried to access the chart's audit trail today, after the preservation notice was filed, but before it had been fully processed. Someone who had understood at some point during the past 24 hours that the equipment logs were the specific threat to the story they had been telling, which meant someone was several steps ahead, which meant this was not just Celeste acting alone. She met Reeves in person the next morning. She told her about Cho's call, about the access attempt, about everything. Reeves listened. When Audrey finished, Reeves said, "You understand what this suggests? That Celeste had help, or that she told someone what she'd done, and that person is now trying to protect her. Either way, someone within the hospital system has knowledge of both the modification and the vulnerability it creates. If they accessed the audit trail, the system flagged it before they could do anything." Reeves said it steadily. Cho's call confirmed the flag. "The logs are intact." Audrey nodded. "But now we have a different problem," she said. "Yes, the hearing." Reeves opened a folder. "The Clinical Integrity Committee has scheduled the preliminary hearing for Thursday. That's 4 days." She slid a document across the desk. "This is the formal notice. Read the allegation section." Audrey picked it up. She read it. She read the first allegation: improper access to confidential patient records motivated by personal interest rather than clinical concern, and that was the expected one, the one Celeste had telegraphed from the beginning. She read the second allegation: conduct unbecoming a medical professional, specifically regarding the alleged initiation of a personal relationship with a patient during an active care episode, and that was the one Celeste had threatened her with in the cardiology charting room. Then she read the third allegation. She read it twice. The third allegation stated that Nurse Pembroke had, on multiple occasions over a period of 2 years, potentially accessed or disclosed confidential patient information to non-hospital parties as part of an ongoing personal relationship with an individual whose identity and affiliations raised concerns relevant to hospital security protocols. She set the document down. "When was this added?" she said. "The notice was issued this morning." "This wasn't in the original complaint." "No." Reeves looked at her steadily. "This was added by the hospital's legal department, not by Harrow. This means someone in administration reviewed the situation and added this independently, because of who Grayson is. Because someone did enough research in the past 48 hours to know who Grayson Thorne is and to understand that nurse with access to patient records who is married to a man with a criminal organization is a very different problem than nurse who disputes a fellow's case narrative." The room was very quiet. Audrey stared at the document. "They're not just protecting Celeste," she said. "No," Reeves said. "I think Celeste's original complaint opened a door, and now the institution is walking through it for its own reasons. They have a liability issue. If there's any suggestion that confidential patient data was accessed improperly, and the person married to the nurse in question is, there's no evidence of that. There's no evidence because it didn't happen. I know that. I have never—" Audrey stopped, pressed her fingers flat on the desk, started again. "I have never accessed a patient record outside of my clinical duties. Not once. Not his, not anyone else's. Not a single access that wasn't clinically justified. I believe you. Can you prove it?" Reeves held her gaze. "Your access logs will show your pattern over 12 years. That's actually one of our strongest arguments, a consistent 12-year record of access that follows your patient assignment precisely. It's not easy to fabricate consistency." She paused. "But Audrey, there's something I need to ask you, and I need you to hear it as a legal question, not a personal one. Ask it. Is there anything, any interaction, any conversation, any moment where hospital information came up between you and your husband in a way that someone could characterize as disclosure, even inadvertently, even something that seemed entirely innocuous at the time?" Audrey thought. She thought about the 12 months of careful, deliberate between her hospital life and her marriage, about the rule she had established and maintained, about the conversations she had steered, the questions she hadn't answered, the wall she had built and maintained, not because Grayson had asked for it, but because she needed it. "No," she said. "You're certain, I'm certain." Reeves nodded. "Then we build the case on the record. What's our exposure on the third allegation?" A pause. "It's not negligible," Reeves said carefully. "The hospital doesn't need to prove it happened. They need to demonstrate that sufficient concern exists to warrant investigation. And given who your husband is, given who my husband is, the existence of sufficient concern is more or less automatic." Yes. Audrey sat with that. She sat with the specific weight of it, not the injustice of it. She was past the injustice. Injustice was an emotion, and she needed something colder right now, but the tactical reality of it. She had built the entire strategy around keeping Grayson out of this, around proving that what she had done in that emergency room had nothing to do with who she later married, around the pure, documentable, time-stamped fact of her own clinical competence. And now the fact of her marriage was being used to contaminate the entire case. Her phone buzzed on the desk. She looked at it. It was a text from a number she didn't know. 5 words, "We need to talk. Tonight." She stared at it. "Is that Reeves started?" "I don't know who this is." She texted back, "Who is this?" 3 seconds. "Robert Cho." Different phone. Not work. She looked at Reeves. "The technician," Reeves said. "Yes. Do you want to call him here?" Audrey was already dialing. Cho picked up on the first ring. He sounded different than he had the day before, tighter, faster, like someone who had been running through a decision and had only just landed on the other side of it. "I found something," he said. "In the logs. Something I wasn't looking for." "What?" "The access attempt yesterday, the one the system flagged, the one I told you about." "Yes, I traced it." He paused. "I traced it because I was trying to understand where it came from. Whether it was internal, what clearance level, whether it was targeted, or whether someone just pulled the chart generally. And it was targeted, specific chart, specific fields. Whoever accessed it knew exactly what they were looking for. A breath. And it wasn't Celeste Harrow." Audrey's hand tightened on the phone. "Then who?" she said. "The access credentials belong to the office of Dr. William Farrow, the CMO, the chief medical officer." She stood up without meaning to. "Farrow," she said. "His administrative credentials, which could mean him or could mean someone using his terminal or someone with his login. I can't tell you exactly who was sitting at the keyboard, but the access came from his office suite. The full shape of it landed. It wasn't just Celeste protecting a narrative. It wasn't just an institutional liability response. Someone in the administration of the hospital, someone at the level of the chief medical officer, had knowledge of the record modification and had tried to access the audit trail before the preservation notice locked it down. "Cho," she said carefully, "does anyone know you found this?" "No. I ran a routine diagnostic on the flagged access as part of my standard protocol. It looks like maintenance work. Nobody will know what I found from the outside. Can you document it? Preserve your own record of what you found." Already did. It's encrypted and off the hospital system. If you bring this forward officially, I know what happens to me if I bring this forward officially. His voice was very steady. I've been in this building long enough to know what happens to people who flag things about Pharaoh. A pause. But I also know what happens if I don't. She waited. I'll testify, he said, if it goes to a formal hearing. If there's a process where what I found is protected by the process itself. I'll testify, there will be, she said. I'll make sure there is. She hung up. Reeves was watching her. The CMO, Audrey said. Reeves sat back in her chair. Tell me, she said. Audrey told her. Every word. Reeves listened without moving, without writing, without doing anything, except watching Audrey's face with the focused attention of someone recalculating everything. When Audrey finished, the room was very quiet. This isn't a rogue fellow protecting her reputation, Reeves said. No. This is institutional. Someone above Celeste either knew what she did or told her to do it, and when your complaint threatened to expose it, they tried to contain it from the top. Yes. Which means the clinical integrity hearing is being managed by the same institution that has a stake in the outcome. Yes. Audrey's voice was flat and cold and very certain. Which means the clinical integrity hearing isn't enough. Reeves was already nodding. We need to take this outside the hospital. State Health Department, at minimum. Possibly the Joint Commission. If there's evidence of coordinated record falsification involving administrative staff at the CMO level, this stops being an employment dispute and starts being a regulatory matter. How long does that process take? Months, potentially. And in the meantime, you're suspended. The hospital controls the narrative, and Cho is exposed every day he's sitting on what he found. Audrey stood at the window of Reeves's office and looked at the city 14 floors below. Traffic, people, the ordinary machinery of the world continuing without any awareness of the specific catastrophe being assembled in this one office on this one floor. She thought about 12 years of badge swipes through that emergency department door. She thought about the night she had stood at the foot of a stranger's bed and felt something pull tight in her chest and had made a decision based on nothing more than 12 years of learning to trust the pull. She thought about Grayson testifying at a clinical integrity hearing while someone in the CMO's office sat in the audience knowing exactly what they'd tried to do. She thought about Celeste Harrow standing in a red gown in a ballroom, claiming credit with the smooth confidence of someone who had been claiming it for so long she'd almost started to believe it herself. Her phone rang. It was Grayson, she answered. I know, she said before he could speak. I need to tell you something. Tell me, situation is bigger than we thought. A pause. How much bigger? The CMO may be involved. Someone used his credentials to access the audit trail after my preservation notice was filed. Silence. The particular heavy silence of a man who has just been handed information that changes the shape of everything. Audrey, he said slowly, I need to tell you something too. Something in his voice, the quality of it. The specific careful weight made her turn from the window. What? She said. I know William Pharaoh. The room got very still. What do you mean you know him? I mean I know him. From before, not from the legitimate side. He stopped. Started again. Pharaoh ran a series of insurance arrangements through one of my organization's shell structures about 7 years ago, before I started the process of stepping back. It wasn't direct. It was layered, but there was a connection. She stood completely still. He knows who you are, she said. Yes, he's known the whole time. I can't say that with certainty, but it's possible. It's possible that when your complaint was filed and someone connected your name to mine, Pharaoh recognized the situation immediately. Recognized it not just as a liability issue, but as a Grayson stopped. As something he needed to contain before anyone started pulling threads. Because if the record modification is investigated, and if the investigation leads to questions about who had access, and who had motive, and what connections existed, it leads to you. It could, depending on how much someone decided to dig. She closed her eyes. The full architecture of it assembled itself in the dark behind her eyelids. Celeste, who had altered a record to protect her reputation. Pharaoh, who had seen the complaint and recognized not just a hospital liability, but a personal threat, who had understood that a genuine investigation into this chart, this case, this timeline, a sound like green might lead investigators to ask questions about the chief medical officer that had nothing to do with Audrey Pembroke and everything to do with 7 years of buried financial arrangements. Celeste hadn't started this for Farrow, but Farrow was using it for himself. They're working together, she said. Maybe not coordinating, but serving each other's interests. That's worse, she said. That's harder to prove, yes. She opened her eyes. Reeves was watching her from across the desk, with the careful, neutral expression of someone who understood that they were only hearing half a conversation, but that the half they were hearing was significant. Grayson. Audrey kept her voice steady, but her hand was gripping the phone harder than she needed to. You said you've been dismantling the organization. Yes. The Farrow connection, the structures, the arrangements, how much of that has been documented as part of the process you're going through? A pause. Some of it, he said. Do you have an attorney managing that process? Yes. Someone outside the organization. Completely clean. Yes. Call them tonight. Tell them about Farrow. Tell them there's potential for this to surface through a separate legal proceeding, and they need to know the full scope. She breathed. I need to know, is there anything in those records that could be used against you in a way that you haven't already anticipated? Because if Farrow decides the best defense is offense, and he decides to point at you before you point at him, mine. I know, Grayson said. I need to know what's coming. I know, his voice was quiet. There's exposure. I won't lie to you. Some of the arrangements from that period they're not clean. They never were. She stood very still. How much exposure, she said. He took a breath. Enough that if someone decided to use it, it would be significant. The silence between them was not the companionable silence of the kitchen table. It was the silence of two people standing on opposite sides of a consequence they had both known was coming someday and had hoped was someday far away. Okay, she said. Audrey. I said okay. She picked up her bag from the chair. I need to think. I'll be home tonight. Don't do anything until we talk. She hung up. She looked at Reeves. Reeves looked back at her. The case just changed, Audrey said. I heard enough to understand that. The hospital isn't just protecting Celeste. The CMO has personal exposure that a genuine investigation could surface. She set her bag down again. She sat, and my husband has prior connections to Farrow that could be weaponized against both of us if this goes to a regulatory level. Which means if you push for a full external investigations, I expose Grayson. And if you don't push for a full external investigation, Farrow controls the internal process. She pressed her fingers to her forehead, and I lose. Reeves was quiet for a moment. Then she said, there's a third option. Audrey looked at her. The clinical integrity hearing is still Thursday, Reeves said. It's internal. It's controlled by the hospital. Under normal circumstances, that's a disadvantage. But if we go into that hearing with the equipment logs which we have, because Cho confirmed they're preserved, and if we go in with Cho's testimony about the access attempt and who it traced to, and if the patient himself testifies, and if that testimony is strong enough to make the institutional cover-up more expensive than the truth, then Farrow has to calculate whether protecting Celeste is worth what it costs him. Reeves leaned forward. He's not trying to protect her. He's trying to protect himself. If we make it clear in that hearing room that we know about the access attempt, and we know where it came from, and we have someone willing to testify to that under formal proceedings, we make protecting Celeste the most dangerous thing he can do. Yes, Audrey thought. She thought for a long time, turning the shape of it in her mind, the way she turned a clinical problem, not hoping for a clean answer, just looking for the least wrong one. The least wrong one required Grayson in that hearing room. It required Cho on the record. It required the equipment logs presented clearly enough that the committee couldn't look away from what they showed. And it required her to walk into a room where the institution had already decided who she was and make them look at who she actually was instead. She had done harder things. Not many, but some. Prepare the subpoena for the equipment logs, she said. Whatever process we need to use to compel their formal production for the hearing. Done. And I need Cho formally protected before he testifies. Whatever whistleblower filing is available. I'll start it tonight. Audrey stood up. She picked up her bag. She thought about the badge in her pocket, the badge that didn't open the doors anymore, and she thought about Thursday. And she thought about Grayson sitting in a hearing room with his old hospital wristband and the name Andrew Hale and everything that came after it. She thought about the moment in that emergency bay when she had moved the crash cart to within 6 feet of his bed, not because she knew she was right, but because the cost of being wrong was something she could survive, and the cost of silence was something he might not. She was about to do it again, at scale, with consequences she couldn't fully see yet. She walked to the door. "Audrey," Reeves said. She stopped. "If Farrow decides to use your husband's exposure as a weapon in the hearing, or outside it, what does your husband want to do?" Audrey stood with her hand on the door. "He wants to protect me," she said. "He's wanted to protect me since the night this started." She pushed the door open. "What he's going to have to do instead is stand there and let me protect both of us." She walked out into the corridor, into the ordinary competent hum of a building that did not know what was coming on Thursday. And she felt the specific cold clarity of someone who has run out of safe options and has decided that the only thing left to do is be completely, uncompromisingly right in a room full of people who are counting on her to be wrong. Thursday arrived, the way bad days always do, without ceremony, without warning in the weather, just a regular morning that happened to contain something that could end everything. Audrey was up at 5 a.m. She hadn't slept well. Not because of fear exactly. She had moved past fear somewhere around Tuesday, when she'd sat at the kitchen table for 4 hours, rehearsing every question the committee might ask, and every answer she intended to give, but because her body understood what her mind was managing, and her body was not as disciplined as her mind. She'd lain awake listening to Grayson breathe beside her, that steady, controlled rhythm of a man who slept lightly and knew it, and she'd stared at the ceiling and thought about timestamps. She was good at timestamps. She had always been good at timestamps. She showered. She dressed in the clothes she'd laid out the night before: dark slacks, a white blouse, the kind of clothes that said, "I am serious and I know this room," without trying to perform anything. She made coffee. She drank it standing at the kitchen counter, because sitting felt like conceding something. Grayson came out at 5:40. He was already dressed. Dark suit, no tie, the particular understated quality of a man who understood that the wrong amount of presence in a room could be as damaging as too little. He had understood, without being told, that today was not a day to look like Grayson Thorne, the businessman. Today he needed to look like a man who had once been a patient. He poured coffee. He stood beside her. Neither of them said anything for a minute. "How are you?" he said. "Ready, that's not what I asked." She looked at him. "I'm ready," she said again. And this time she let him hear the difference between the two, that she understood his question and had chosen her answer deliberately. He nodded. "Cho confirmed last night," she said. "He'll be there. Reeves has the whistleblower filing logged. He's protected as of 7 a.m. this morning." "Good." "The equipment logs have been formally produced to the committee. Reeves submitted them Tuesday. The committee has had 48 hours to review them." She set her cup down. "They know what the logs show. They've known for 2 days, which means whoever in that room has a stake in the outcome has had 2 days to figure out how to respond to it. Farrow. She picked up her bag. "He'll be in the room. The CMO is an ex officio member of the Clinical Integrity Committee. He has a seat at the table." Grayson was quiet for a moment. "You're walking into a hearing," he said, "where one of the people judging it has been trying to suppress your evidence." "Yes, and your strategy is to make that visible." "My strategy is to make everything visible, including that." She met his eyes. "If we do this right, Farrow can't move against us in that room without exposing himself. The best thing he can do is sit there and hope the committee doesn't look too hard. And if he decides the best defense is to go on offense, then we're ready for that too." She said it with more certainty than she entirely felt, and he knew it, and he didn't call her on it, because that was one of the things she loved about him. He knew the difference between a lie and a decision. The Clinical Integrity Committee convened at 9 a.m. in the hospital's administrative conference room on the 7th floor, which was a room Audrey had passed by hundreds of times without ever going inside. It was larger than she'd expected. A long rectangular table, 12 chairs, a projector screen at the far end, and windows that looked out over the street below, where the city was doing its ordinary Thursday thing, entirely unaware. 5 committee members were already seated when Audrey and Reeves walked in. She recognized 2 of them: Dr. Patricia Voss, the committee chair, a 60-year-old internist with a reputation for patience and a lower threshold for institutional politics than she let on, And Harriet Lowe, the foundation board member who had been at the gala, who had said, "I think I need another drink," and given the circle permission to break apart. Lowe saw Audrey. Something in her expression shifted, not unfriendly, but evaluating. Farrow was at the far end of the table. He was 64, heavyset in the way of a man who had once been athletic and had not entirely kept up with it, with gray hair and the practiced neutral expression of a hospital administrator who had spent 3 decades managing rooms. He looked at Audrey when she came in. He looked at her the way someone looks at a problem they have already categorized. She looked back at him with something she hoped read as the same caliber of settiness, because she didn't believe, for the next hour, that she did not know what she knew about him. Celeste, already seated on the opposite side of the room, at a separate table with her own attorney, a man in his 50s named Gerald Marsh, who had the smooth, unbothered quality of someone who billed by the hour and was not personally invested in outcomes. Celeste was in a charcoal blazer. Her hair was pulled back. She looked like a physician at a formal proceeding, which was exactly what she was trying to look like. She did not look at Audrey when she came in. Grayson arrived 90 seconds later. The room changed when he walked in. Audrey had seen it happen before in restaurants, in lobbies, in the hospital gala, that specific shift in attention that certain people produce without doing anything, just by being present. He carried it like weather. He found a seat at the back of the room, the witness section, and he sat down, and he folded his hands, and he looked at nothing in particular. Farrow looked at him. It was a brief look, controlled. But Audrey caught it from across the room, that split second of recognition, not of a patient's family member, not of a foundation donor, but of something older and more complicated, and she filed it. Dr. Voss called the session to order. The preliminary framing was procedural and mostly irrelevant, the kind of institutional language that existed to remind everyone in the room that this was a formal process with rules. Audrey listened without fidgeting. Reeves sat beside her with a yellow legal pad and a pen, and the focused stillness of a woman who had been in rooms like this before and knew that the first 15 minutes were almost never the ones that mattered. Then Voss said, "This committee has reviewed the submitted evidence in advance of this session. We'll be hearing from the parties directly." She looked at Celeste's table first. "Dr. Harrow, your complaint initiated this proceeding. We'll hear from you first." Celeste spoke for 14 minutes. She was good at it. Audrey had known she would be. Celeste was intelligent and articulate, and had spent years in a profession that required her to explain complicated things clearly under pressure. She described the night in question with the confident fluency of someone who had told this version enough times that it had become, in her own mind, the real one. She described her initial evaluation. She described the monitoring order she'd placed. A sound like green wood splitting. She described being called back to the patient's bedside when his condition escalated, and coordinating with the attending physician to manage the emergency. She described Audrey as part of the nursing team that night, competent, present, one of several staff members contributing to the patient's care. She described Audrey's formal complaint as motivated by personal interest, specifically by a relationship with the patient that she suggested had begun during the care episode itself, or shortly after, in a way that created ethical questions about Audrey's access to records and her motivations for disputing the clinical narrative. She was careful. She was precise. She did not overstate. She left the implications in the negative space and let the committee fill it in. When she finished, Voss said, "Thank you, Dr. Harrow." She looked at Audrey's table. Miss Pembroke. Audrey stood. She did not use notes. She had considered it. Reeves had prepared a structured outline, thorough and well-organized, but she had decided, the night before, that notes would make her look like she was reciting someone else's argument, and she was not reciting anyone else's argument. She was telling the committee what she had seen, what she had done, and what had been done to the record of it afterward. She knew it the way she knew how to assess a patient, not because she'd memorized a protocol, but because she had been there. She started with the moment she had stood at the foot of Andrew Hale's bed and looked at the monitor. She was specific. She gave the time 11:47 p.m. admission. She gave the initial presentation. She gave Celeste's assessment and the monitoring order. She gave the specific observation she had made. between 11:47 and 11:53 that told her something was changing the blood pressure numbers, the diaphoresis, the quality of the patient's pain as it moved, the specific change in his jaw when the discomfort shifted location. She described her conversation with Dr. Webb, the words she had used, his initial response, his agreement to the repeat ECG. She described returning to the bay, the second ECG, the V4 change, the time she had submitted the escalation request into the system. She described moving the crash cart. She described staying. She said, "The committee has the equipment logs. I'd ask you to look specifically at 3 timestamps, the oxygen flow adjustment at 11:52 p.m., the ECG print at 11:54 p.m., and the crash cart movement sensor at 11:57 p.m. Dr. Harrow's note describes her return to the patient's bedside as initiating the escalation sequence. Her note was amended to reflect this on the night in question, at 4:17 a.m. after her shift. The equipment timestamps show that the escalation sequence I've described was already in motion before that return. The room was very quiet. Voss looked at the document in front of her. One of the other committee members, a physician, Audrey didn't know by name, was writing something. Farrell was very still. Celeste's attorney leaned toward her and said something quiet. Celeste's expression did not change. Voss said, "You're saying the equipment log record predates Dr. Harrow's involvement. I'm saying the equipment logs confirm that the sequence I've described is accurate and that it precedes the sequence described in Dr. Harrow's amended note." "The amendment," Voss said carefully. I'm characterizing it as a repositioning of the clinical timeline that's inconsistent with the equipment record." Audrey kept her voice level. "I'll let the committee decide what that means." "Marsh," Celeste's attorney said, "if I may." He didn't wait. "The equipment timestamps record machine activity. They don't record clinical decision-making. A nurse can adjust oxygen flow for any number of routine reasons. A crash cart can be moved in anticipation of a general department need. These timestamps do not establish causation or sequence in the way Ms. Pembroke is implying." Reeves said, "Without standing, the escalation request in the system, the formal request logged under Nurse Pembroke's credentials at 11:53 p.m. Requesting emergency cardiology consultation is not a machine activity. It's a documented clinical decision with a name and a timestamp attached to it. It precedes Dr. Harrow's note by over 30 minutes. A beat." Marsh said notes can be filed at any time. "The request was filed at 11:53, Reeves said. "Not the note, the request. Through the hospital's clinical decision support system, which logs every submission in real time." "Another beat," Voss said. "We'll take that under consideration." She looked at Audrey. "You may..." Audrey sat. Grayson was called next. He stood and walked to the front of the room, with the unhurried certainty of a man who had been in much harder rooms than this, for much higher stakes, a sound like green wood splitting, and who had learned that the most dangerous thing you could do in a room full of people watching you was to look like you were performing. He didn't perform. He sat down in the witness chair, and he looked at Voss and he said, "I'll tell you what I remember." He told it in sequence the way Audrey had told it, not dramatized, not embellished, with the particular flat clarity of someone describing a thing they actually experienced. He described waking in the bay. He described Celeste's examination, her manner, the monitoring order. He described the sensation of the pain changing, which he described with the specific uncomfortable candor of someone who had been genuinely frightened and was not going to pretend otherwise. He said, "She came back. The nurse, Audrey. She asked me how the pain was. I told her it had moved." He paused. "She was out of that bay inside 45 seconds. And things started moving." He put the hospital wristband on the table. Andrew Hale. The name in black ink, slightly faded, the plastic creased where he'd worn it for 3 days. "I was conscious for most of that night," he said. "I was not out of my mind with pain. I was scared, but I was aware. I know the difference between the person who what was happening to me and the person who came back to manage it after it had been identified." He looked at Voss. "They are not the same person, Marsh," said Mr. Thorne. "You have a personal relationship with Miss Pembroke. I do. When did that relationship begin?" "After my discharge from this hospital." "You're certain?" Grayson looked at him with the particular patience of a man who was being asked a question by someone who understood exactly what the answer was and was asking it anyway. "I'm certain, and it didn't influence your recollection of the events of that night." No. You understand that from the committee's perspective, a witness who is married to the complainant. I understand the concern, Grayson said. I'd ask the committee to consider this. The night I was brought into this hospital, I was registered under a false name. No one in this building knew who I was. The nurse who escalated my care didn't know my name, my wealth, or anything else about me. She made a clinical decision about a man named Andrew Hale based on what she observed in a hospital bed. He let that sit for a moment. No amount of personal feeling, mine or hers, could retroactively change what she did before she knew I existed. The room sat with that. Even Marsh didn't answer it immediately. Then Celeste spoke. She hadn't been asked to speak. She spoke anyway. The question, she said, her voice carrying the tight control of someone who had been waiting and had reached the end of waiting, is not just about that night. The question is about a pattern of access, about a nurse with confidential record access who is married to a man with, she stopped, recalibrated, with significant outside interests. And whether that combination creates a situation the hospital has an obligation to. Dr. Harrow, Voss said sharply. Celeste stopped. You'll address the committee through proper procedure, Voss said. Not from the floor, a beat. Celeste sat back, but she had opened the door. Farrow, who had not spoken once during the entire proceeding, who had sat at the end of the table with the practiced stillness of a man managing his exposure, looked down at the document in front of him. Then he said, I think Dr. Harrow's point raises a legitimate institutional question that the committee should address. The room shifted. Voss looked at him. The allegation regarding Ms. Pembroke's external relationship, Farrow kept his voice measured, administrative. The voice of a CMO performing concern raises questions that go beyond the specific clinical dispute. The committee should consider whether a formal audit of Ms. Pembroke's record access history is warranted before. Dr. Farrow. Reeves was on her feet. Voss looked at her. If I may, Reeves said, there is a matter of evidence that I believe the committee needs to address before Dr. Farrow's recommendation is considered. A pause. Voss said, what matter? On the day following, Miss Pembroke's preservation notice, after the hospital had been formally notified that all records related to this case were to be preserved and access its attempt, was made to the audit trail of Mr. Hale's chart. The attempt was flagged automatically by the hospital's security system. We have the system log. She opened her folder. We also have testimony from a member of the hospital's data infrastructure team who traced the access credentials. The room was no longer quiet. It was the specific not quiet of people controlling their breathing and their faces with varying degrees of success. Voss said, what credentials? The access was made using credentials registered to the office of the chief medical officer. Every head turned toward Farrow. He did not move. He sat completely still at the end of the table, and Audrey watched him process it, the calculation happening behind his eyes, the rapid reassessment of the room, the specific moment when a man decides whether to fight or to manage, and she saw him choose management. I have no knowledge of any such access, he said. My credentials may be used by members of my administrative team in the normal course of minutes. We're prepared to call the witness, Reeves said. The infrastructure technician who traced the access and documented his findings before the preservation notice was fully processed. I'd like to hear from the witness, Voss said. Marsh was on his feet. This is outside the scope of this proceeding. This committee is convened to address a specific clinical dispute, not to conduct a pint. The scope of this committee, Voss said, without raising her voice, includes the integrity of hospital records and any conduct that may have compromised that integrity. Sit down, Mr. Marsh. A beat Marsh sat. Robert Cho came in from the anteroom where he had been waiting. He was 38. Average height, with the particular bearing of someone who had spent the morning deciding they were going to do something they were afraid of and had come out the other side of it. He sat into the witness chair, and he held his hand still on the table, and he did not look at Farrow. He was under oath. He told the committee what he had found. He described the flagged access, the trace, the credentials. He described encrypting his findings and logging them off the hospital system. He described why he had come forward. When he finished, the room was the kind of quiet that precedes something irreversible. Voss said, Dr. Farrow, I'm going to ask you directly whether you or anyone using your administrative credentials attempted to access the audit trail of this chart after receipt of the preservation notice. Farrow looked at her. The calculation behind his eyes was still running, but the options were narrowing visibly. "I'll need to consult with legal counsel before responding to that," he said. "That is your right," Voss said. "And the committee will note your response, for the record." She made a note. Marsh leaned to Celeste and said something fast and low, and whatever it was, Celeste's face changed. Not dramatically, she was too controlled for dramatic, but the particular set of her jaw shifted, and she looked suddenly, for the first time, splitting, like someone who had just understood that the room she was in was not the room she had thought it was when she'd arrived. Grayson had not moved from the witness chair. He was watching Harrow with the calm, patient attention of a man who understood better than anyone else in the room what it looked like when someone had run out of workable options. Voss set down her pen, she said. "I'm going to suspend this session for 30 minutes while the committee confers privately." She looked at both tables. Both parties will remain in the building. The anteroom they were directed to was small, a corridor waiting area, with chairs along one wall and a water dispenser in the corner that hummed with a sound like something mechanical thinking. Audrey sat. Reeves stood. Grayson came in and didn't sit, which was his nature. He stood near the door, with his arms loosely at his sides, and looked at the floor and said nothing. Shaw was at the far end of the corridor, with his own small cluster of space. Audrey looked at the water dispenser. "Harrow's going to lawyer up," she said. "He already is in there." "Yes," Reeves said. "Which means he's not going to say anything that helps Celeste. If protecting himself means letting her carry the record modification alone, he'll let her carry it." "He was never trying to protect her," Grayson said quietly, from near the door. "He was trying to protect the connection. Once the connection is at risk, Celeste becomes a liability," Audrey said. The corridor was very quiet. 30 minutes was a long time to sit with the specific anxiety of not knowing which direction a room had tilted. Audrey had learned, in 12 years of emergency medicine, that the waiting was its own kind of work, that you couldn't shortcut it, couldn't metabolize it faster than it wanted to go, could only sit inside it and make sure you hadn't missed anything. She ran through it again. Equipment logs, timestamp sequence, Cho's testimony, the access trace, Grayson's account, the wristband on the table. She had built this case out of the only things that couldn't lie, not notes, not memory, not testimony filtered through self-interest, but the machine records of a building that had been doing its job all along without knowing anyone would ever need it to. She had been right that night. She had been right about everything that came after. The only question was whether right was going to be enough. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She looked at it. A text from an unknown number with a 212 area code. "Harrow's attorney just called mine. Exploring options. She's looking at whether cooperation with the committee changes her exposure." She stared at it. Then she understood. Gerald Marsh had reached out to Reeves's office. Celeste was looking for a deal. She showed Reeves. Reeves read it. She said, "That means she's calculating that Harrow isn't going to cover for her." "She's right," Grayson said. "If she cooperates, if she confirms the modification and provides a full account of what she did and why." Reeves was already thinking forward. It changes her exposure dramatically. Not eliminates, but changes. "Can we trust it?" Audrey said. Reeves looked at her. "We don't need to trust it. We need it on the record under oath." Audrey nodded. She put the phone back in her pocket. She looked at the wall. She thought about Celeste in the charting room, saying, "You're just a nurse," with the smooth confidence of someone who had been certain the floor would hold. She thought about the gala, the red dress, the circle of doctors and donors, the way Celeste had steered her by the elbow to the place where she could be displayed. She did not feel triumphant. She felt the specific, flat exhaustion of someone who had been right in a room full of people trying to make her wrong, and was now waiting to find out whether the room had finally run out of places to go. The door to the conference room opened. A staff member looked out. "The committee is ready," she said. Audrey stood up. Grayson moved to her side, not in front, never in front, always exactly beside her. And she felt the steadiness of him there the way she'd felt it. The night she'd finally understood she was going to marry him, which was not a night of romance or grandeur, but a Tuesday evening in the diner when she'd told him about a patient she'd lost, and he'd just sat with her in the silence of it. She picked up her bag. She straightened her back. She walked toward the door. Inside the conference room, the 5 committee members were seated. Harrow's chair at the end of the table was empty. Voss looked at them as they came in. Dr. Farrow has recused himself from the remainder of this session, she said, pending a separate administrative review. She set her hands flat on the table. We've also been informed that Dr. Harrow's counsel has requested a brief recess to discuss her client's position with the committee. Marsh was standing beside Celeste's table. Celeste was looking at the table in front of her. She was not looking at Audrey. Voss said, "Before we proceed, Ms. Pembroke, I want to address something directly." She looked at Audrey with the steady, careful attention of someone who had been doing this long enough to know that what she said next would matter. The committee has reviewed the equipment logs in full. We've heard the testimony of Mr. Cho regarding the access attempt and its origin. We have the timestamp record of the escalation request submitted under your credentials at 11:53 p.m. A pause. The sequence is not ambiguous. The room held its breath. The record as it currently stands, Voss continued, does not accurately reflect the clinical events of that night. Audrey held very still. Marsh said, "The committee should note that, Doctor. Harrow is prepared to provide a full account of—" "We'll hear from Dr. Harrow in due course," Voss said. She did not look away from Audrey. "I want you to know, Ms. Pembroke, that this committee understands what you did to bring this forward. The proper channel, the correct process." She paused. "That matters. It was not an apology. It was not a verdict. It was a woman in a position of institutional authority, sitting in a room where the institution had behaved badly, telling the person who had pushed back against it that she had been seen. It was enough. For now it was enough." Audrey said, "Thank you." Voss nodded. She looked at Marsh. "Let's hear what Dr. Harrow has to say." Celeste Harrow looked up from the table. For the first time since this entire thing had started, she looked directly at Audrey. And in that look was the entirety of it, not remorse. Not exactly. Splitting. But the specific, defeated awareness of someone who had built something on a foundation they'd known was wrong and had just watched it come down exactly the way they'd always known it could. She opened her mouth. She started to speak. And everything that had been buried in a medical record at 4:17 a.m. 2 years ago, in the particular darkness of a decision that had seemed survivable at the time, began finally, irreversibly, to come into the light. Celeste Harrow spoke for 41 minutes. Audrey knew because she was watching the clock on the wall, behind Voss's head, not obsessively, not anxiously, but with the same groundedness she brought to everything that required her to stay present inside something difficult. 41 minutes, the length of a moderate complexity surgery, the length of a shift handover on a busy night. Long enough to say everything that needed saying, if you were willing to say it. Celeste was willing. Not because she had become a different person in the space of a 30-minute recess. People did not become different people in 30 minutes. What had changed was the math, the specific, unsentimental arithmetic of a woman who had run the numbers and understood that the story she had been telling was no longer the cheapest story available to her. She described the night accurately this time. She described her initial evaluation. She described the monitoring order. She described leaving the bay. She described being paged back, not because she had planned a reassessment, but because the attending had been alerted and the situation had already escalated beyond what her order anticipated. She described, in the careful language of someone who had been a physician long enough to know exactly what words meant in a formal record, that when she returned to Andrew Hale's bedside, the escalation sequence had already been initiated by the nursing staff. She did not say Audrey's name for the first 3 minutes. Then Voss asked her directly, who initiated the escalation? A pause. Nurse Pembroke, Celeste said. The words landed in the room, the way things land when they have been a long time coming, not with drama, not what the sharp crack of something breaking, but with the dull final weight of something settling into its correct position. Voss wrote something, she said, and the amendment to your note at 4:17 a.m. Another pause. Longer I amended it, Celeste said. To what purpose? Celeste looked at the table. Her hands were flat on it, very still, the hands of someone who had made a decision and was now living inside it, 1 second at a time. To clarify my role in the case. To clarify it, Voss said, or to reposition it. A silence that was its own kind of answer. To reposition it, Celeste said. The room did not react dramatically. There was no gasp, no collective exhale. The committee members wrote things. One of them, the physician Audrey hadn't known by name, who had been writing steadily throughout the entire session, stopped writing and looked at Celeste with the specific expression of someone who who had hoped the answer would be different and was not surprised that it wasn't. Marsh said, "The committee should note that Dr. Harrow's candor at this stage of the proceeding." "We'll note it," Voss said. She looked at Audrey. "Mrs. Pembroke," she said, "is there anything you'd like to add before the committee deliberates?" Audrey had prepared for this question. She had thought about it for 3 days, had written versions of what she might say, had rehearsed positions and discarded them. She had imagined saying something definitive, something that closed the narrative cleanly, something that would make the room understand not just what had happened to the medical record, but what it had cost her, the badge, the access, the 12 years of careful professional distance from her husband's world that she had maintained because she needed her competence to be entirely and unquestionably her own. She looked at Voss. She said, "No, a beat. The record will show what happened," she said. "That's all I ever needed." Voss held her gaze for a moment. Then she nodded. "The committee will deliberate," she said. "We'll reconvene in 1 hour. The hour passed the way hours pass when you've done everything you can, and there's nothing left to do but exist inside the waiting, slowly and with too much awareness of every small thing. The hum of the water dispenser, the sound of foot traffic in the corridor outside, the particular quality of Grayson's silence beside her, which was the silence of a man who had kept a very large promise and was now sitting in the aftermath of it. Reeves made a phone call. 2 phone calls. She came back and sat down without saying what they were about, which meant they were about the next phase, the regulatory filings, the state health department notification, the process that would now inevitably begin outside the hospital, regardless of what the committee decides inside it. Cho sat at the far end of the corridor and looked at his phone and didn't look at anyone else, which was fine. He had done what he came to do. The rest was not his to carry. At one point, Grayson said quietly, "You're not going to tell me I was right to stay out of it." Audrey looked at him. "You were right to stay out of it." "You said you weren't going to tell me that." "I changed my mind." She looked back at the wall. "You were right. You did what I asked. That matters." A pause. "It was the hardest thing I've done in a long time," he said. "I know. I'm not saying that for credit. I know that too." She turned to look at him, at his profile, at the particular set of his jaw that she had learned to read over months of learning to read him. "I'm saying I know, because I was watching you not do it for 4 days, and I know what it cost." He was quiet. "It's not nothing," she said, "what you did. Staying out of it. It felt like nothing. That's how you know it was real." He turned to look at her then, and in his face was something she recognized, not the controlled, assessed expression of a man managing a room, but the specific, unguarded look of someone who has been seen clearly and is not entirely sure what to do with it. She reached over and put her hand on his. They sat like that until the door opened. The committee's findings were delivered by Voss directly, without ceremony, in the measured language of institutional accountability, which was the only language institutions knew how to use when they had to admit they'd gotten something wrong. The clinical record of Andrew Hale, admitted on the relevant date, was found to be inaccurate as amended. The original escalation, as documented by nurse Audrey Pembroke prior to the amendment, was determined to be consistent with the equipment log record and with the testimony of the patient. The amendment made by Dr. Celeste Harrow at 4:17 a.m. was determined to constitute an improper modification of a medical record in violation of the hospital's clinical documentation standards and applicable professional conduct guidelines. Nurse Pembroke's suspension was lifted, effective immediately. Her access credentials would be restored by end of business that day. Her documented contribution to the care of the patient on the night in question would be permanently restored to the medical record in its original form. Dr. Harrow was placed on administrative leave, pending a full disciplinary review. The matter would be referred to the State Medical Licensing Board. The committee further noted that the question of the access attempt, made using CMO credentials after the preservation notice was filed, would be referred to the hospital's board of directors for independent review separate from and additional to this proceeding. Voss said all of this without editorial. Without apology, because the committee could not apologize, could not acknowledge in formal language that they had suspended a nurse on the basis of a complaint made by the person who had falsified the record, that they had given institutional weight to Celeste's version before they had looked carefully at whether it was true. What Voss did instead, When she had finished the formal statement and the committee members were gathering their papers, and the room was beginning its slow exhale, was look at Audrey directly across the length of the table and hold her gaze for one additional second. It was not an apology. It was an acknowledgement. A sound like green wood splitting, a specific human, imperfect acknowledgement from one professional to another that something had happened in this building that should not have happened, and that the person sitting across from her had been right to push back against it. Audrey held that look. She nodded once. Voss nodded back. Then she gathered her papers, and the formal part of it was over. The hallway outside the conference room was ordinary in the particular way that hallways are ordinary. After something large has happened, in the room they adjoined just a hallway, fluorescent lights, linoleum floor, a drinking fountain on the far wall, and people moving through it who did not know what had just occurred behind that closed door. Audrey stood in it and breathed. Reeves touched her arm briefly. "I'll start the state filing today," she said. "The Farrow matter won't resolve through the board quickly, but we have enough documented to ensure it doesn't disappear." "Cho," Audrey said, "I'll make sure he's protected through the whistleblower status. Whatever comes of the Farrow investigation, his testimony is sealed to the formal process. He can't be retaliated against without the hospital, exposing itself to additional liability." Reeves looked at her steadily. He knew that when he came forward. He did it anyway. "I know." Audrey looked down the corridor to where Cho was still sitting, waiting, his hands still on his knees in the same posture he'd held for the past hour. She walked toward him. He looked up when she got close. She said, "Thank you." He looked at her for a moment, splitting. He had the slightly wrung-out quality of someone who had done something that took more out of them than they'd anticipated. It was the right thing, he said. It was also a hard thing. Yeah. He exhaled. Yeah, it was. She didn't say anything else about it. She didn't tell him it would be fine. She didn't tell him it would fine, because she didn't know that it would be entirely fine. The road through the Farrow investigation would be long and institutional and nobody's idea of comfortable. But she had meant what she'd said to Reeves, and she meant what she said to him now. If anything comes at you through this process, call Reeves. Don't wait, call her the same day. He nodded. Okay, he said. She walked back to where Grayson was waiting. He was standing with his hands in his pockets, looking at nothing in particular. When she came to stand in front of him, she saw that he had held himself together through all of it, through 4 days of watching her carry something he wasn't allowed to help with, through the hearing room and the testimony and the specific controlled agony of sitting in a witness chair and being asked if his feelings had influenced his memory. And that now, in the ordinary fluorescent hallway with the formal part of it over, something in him had released that she hadn't realized had been held. He looked tired. Genuinely, entirely tired, in a way she hadn't seen on him before. Not the performance of exhaustion, not the managed presentation of a man under pressure, but the real thing, the look of someone who had spent 4 days being careful and had now run out of careful. She stepped forward and put her arms around him. He was still for 1 second. Then he put his arms around her and held her in the particular way he held her, when neither of them was managing anything, not tightly, not desperately, just present, just there, his chin at her temple and her face against his shoulder, and the sound of the building continuing around them as if nothing significant had happened, which was the nature of buildings and always had been. They stood like that for a while. Then she said into his shoulder, "Take me home." "Yeah," he said. "Okay." The weeks that followed were not clean. She had known they wouldn't be. She had spent 12 years in emergency medicine, which meant she had spent 12 years learning that resolutions were not the same as endings, that things did not conclude neatly at the moment of their apparent resolution, but continued forward through paperwork and process, and the slow, unglamorous aftermath of consequence. The clinical integrity committee's findings were distributed within the hospital on a Monday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, 3 people from her department had texted her colleagues, nurses she'd worked alongside, people who knew her by the specific knowledge of shared shifts and shared emergencies, and all 3 messages said roughly the same thing in different words. We knew. We knew it wasn't right. She appreciated the messages. She did not entirely know what to do with them. Because there was something complicated in the gratitude, something that asked the question she was too tired to examine right now, which was, if they knew, why did it take this long? She set the question aside. She had enough to carry without it. Her access was restored on the Thursday, following the hearing, as the committee had specified. She swiped her badge at the emergency department doors at 7 a.m. and stood in the corridor for a moment, listening to the sounds of the department, the monitors, the voices, sips, the particular organized noise of a place that is always in the middle of something, and let it settle over her, the way a place you've been away from settles when you return to it. Different and exactly the same. She went to work. She did not perform her return. She did not announce it or make it mean anything beyond what it was. A nurse back at her station, doing the thing she had spent 12 years learning to do. Dr. Webb was on shift. He saw her from the nursing station and walked over and said, without preamble, "Good to have you back." "Thank you, Marcus. I should have." When Harrow pushed back on the second ECG, he stopped. He was not a man who apologized easily. She knew that about him, had known it for years. "I should have backed you faster." She looked at him. "You backed me." "After I hesitated. You're human." She picked up the first chart from the station. "So am I. Let's just work." He held her gaze for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." The disciplinary review of Celeste Harrow moved through the hospital's formal process over the following 6 weeks. It was thorough in the way that institutional processes are thorough when they have to be, when the alternative to thoroughness is more expensive than the discomfort of looking carefully. The record modification was confirmed, documented, and classified as a serious violation of clinical documentation standards. The state's medical licensing board was notified per the committee's referral. Celeste's hospital privileges were terminated at the end of the review period. Audrey was not informed of this directly. She read it in the formal notification that went to all clinical staff as a matter of record. She read it on a Tuesday afternoon between patients, sitting at a computer terminal in the emergency department, and she sat with it for a moment, the fact of it, the weight of it, the complicated, non-triumphant reality of what it meant. Celeste Harrow had been a physician. Whatever she had done, whatever the specific architecture of ambition and fear and self-interest that had led her to that 4:17 a.m. decision, she had been a physician before she was any of those things. That was gone now. Not permanently, the licensing board process would take its own course, and what it decided, but gone from this building. Gone from this particular chapter of a career that had made one enormous mistake and then made more mistakes trying to contain it. Audrey did not feel victorious. She felt the specific, depleted flatness of someone who had been in a long fight and had come out the right side of it without any illusion that the right side was the same as the easy side. She closed the notification. She went back to work. The Farrow matter was slower and more complicated, as she had known it would be. The hospital's board of directors commissioned an independent review. The independent review expanded in scope when the reviewers, following the audit trail Cho had documented, found evidence of additional record access patterns over a period of several years that did not align with standard CMO functions. Farrow retained legal counsel and did not cooperate with the independent review, which was his right, and which also told the board everything it needed to know. He resigned in the third week of the review, before the formal findings were issued. The resignation was announced in a press release that described it as a decision made in the best interests of the institution during a period of administrative transition, which was the language institutions used when the alternative was specificity. Reeves told Audrey about the resignation by text on a Wednesday morning. Audrey was in the break room, eating the first thing she'd had time to eat in 6 hours, which was a granola bar that tasted like compressed cardboard. And she read the text and set her phone down and thought about William Farrow for a moment, not with satisfaction, not with anything that resembled satisfaction, but with the specific complicated awareness of someone who understood that what Farrow had done to try to suppress her case had originated in his own fear of exposure, and that his exposure had now come regardless. Whatever arrangements he had made with whatever organizations 7 years ago, that was a thread that others would now pull. Reeves had ensured the documentation was in appropriate hands. What happened from there was not Audrey's to manage, and she was grateful for that. She finished the granola bar. She went back to work. The conversation with Grayson happened on a Saturday, not planned. Saturday morning, coffee, the particular late morning quiet of a weekend when neither of them had anywhere to be immediately. He was at the kitchen table with the newspaper he still read in physical form. because he was 42 and had habits, and she was standing at the counter in the specific non-dressed state of someone who has woken up without an agenda, which was a state she reached rarely enough that she paid attention to it when it arrived. She said, "Tell me where you are with it." He looked up from the paper. He didn't ask what she meant. "The attorney filed the last of the organizational separation documents last week," he said. "The legitimate entities are fully separated. The shell structures are being wound down through the legal framework we've been building. The people involved," he paused. "The people who were part of the operation have been given terms. Some of them are cooperating with the federal process. Some aren't. And you and me." He set the newspaper down. He looked at her with the directness he'd always given her, that specific quality of his honesty that had been one of the first things she'd recognized in him. "There are things from the past 7 years that can't be cleaned. I knew that when I started this process. The attorney has been building a cooperation framework. The federal exposure is real. The legal consequences are what they are. Prison," she said, "not a question. Possibly. Probably not with the cooperation framework, but possibly." He held her gaze. "I'm not going to tell you it's going to be fine, because I don't know that." She nodded. "I know," she said. "You should know what you're—" "Grayson." She set her cup down. "I knew who you were before we got married. I'm not going to perform surprise now, because the consequences are becoming real." She looked at him steadily. "What I need to know is that you're not protecting me from any part of it. What I need to know is that what you told me just now is the whole truth and not a managed version of it." He looked at her for a long time. "The federal process could take 2 years to fully resolve," he said. "During that time, there will be things that become public. About the organization, about the specific operations, about people I worked with. Some of it will be reported. Some of it will be attached to my name in ways I can't control." "And attached to mine," she said. "Yes, I'm aware of that." "Audrey," I said, "I'm aware of it." She picked up her cup again. "I'm not asking you to protect me from it. I'm asking you to stop treating it like something I haven't already thought about." He sat back in his chair. He looked at her with something that was almost not quite, but almost a full exhale of everything he'd been holding since the hearing, since the weeks before the hearing, since the night of the gala, when he'd looked across a ballroom and seen her standing in her scrubs under a coat, and understood that the thing he'd spent 42 years building, the particular fortress of self-sufficiency and managed danger and controlled outcomes, was entirely useless to the person he loved most. "I'm trying to learn to do this differently," he said. "I know you are. I'm not good at it yet. You're better than you were." She looked at him. "You sat in that hearing room for 4 hours, and you didn't make a single phone call. You didn't send anyone. You didn't do anything except what I asked." She paused. "That's not nothing, Grayson. That's actually quite a lot." He was quiet. "The organization," she said. "The empire, the network, all of it. I need to ask you something that I haven't asked directly before. Ask it. Is it done? Is the process you're in, is it genuinely aimed at being done? Not managed, not restructured, not handed to someone else to run at arm's length. Done." He held her gaze. "Yes," he said, "it's done. Because of the legal exposure. Partly. What's the other part?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the table, at his hands, at the newspaper he'd been reading when she started this conversation. She waited, because she had learned that his silences were not evasions. They were the specific pauses of a man who was deciding whether to say the exact true thing or a version of the true thing that was easier to say. He said the exact true thing. "Because you saved my life in a building where you didn't know my name," he said, "and then you built 12 years of work that was entirely your own. And then I watched someone try to take that from you, and I couldn't do anything about it because the only tools I had were the tools of the world I was running." He looked up. "I don't want those to be the only tools I have. I want to be someone who can stand next to you in a hallway without the hallway being the least complicated place I've been all week." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the night she had fallen in love with him, the Tuesday evening in the diner, the patient she'd lost, the silence he'd sat with her in. She thought about the courthouse, the dress from a normal store, the witnesses. She thought about the gold chain under her scrubs. She thought about the hearing room and the wristband on the table and the specific quality of him sitting still in the witness chair, doing the hardest thing he'd ever done, which was nothing. See? She walked to the table. She sat down across from him. "Okay," she said. He looked at her. "Okay," she said again. Then we figure out what comes next. What came next was not simple. It never was. The federal process moved on its own timeline, as federal processes did, with its own attorneys and its own language and its own rhythm that had nothing to do with the rhythms of Audrey's shifts or Grayson's efforts to rebuild what the organization had left behind. There were months when it was very present meetings, disclosures, the specific anxiety of not knowing which direction something would turn, and months when it receded to a background awareness, something they both carried without discussing every day, because discussing it every day would have meant living inside it instead of alongside it. Audrey worked. She worked the way she had always worked, with the specific, committed attention of someone for whom the job was not a performance of competence, but the actual thing, the real work, the place where 12 years of training and instinct and accumulated judgment became useful to someone who needed it. She worked the overnight shifts and the holiday shifts and the shifts that ran long because the department was short-staffed, and she was there and she knew what she was doing. She wore her wedding ring on her finger now. Not on the chain, on her finger where it was visible, where her colleagues could see it, and sometimes asked about it, and she answered without elaborating, because the elaboration was not theirs to have. And she had learned a long time ago that privacy was not the same as secrecy, and that the distinction mattered. Some of her colleagues had read the news coverage that came out of the Harrow resignation, a brief piece in a hospital industry publication. Nothing sensational, mostly procedural and understood enough from it to know that something significant had happened and that Audrey had been at the center of it. Nobody asked her directly. She was grateful for that. Dr. Webb, who was not given to personal conversation on shift, said to her once, at the end of a very long night, "You know what the difference is between a good nurse and a great one?" She looked at him. "A good nurse knows the protocol," he said. "A great one knows when the protocol is wrong." He picked up his coffee. You were right. End of lesson." She thought about that for a while. She thought about it green wood splitting. She thought about it the way she thought about the things that mattered, which was not continuously but intermittently returning to it at unexpected moments, finding new angles in it, understanding it slightly differently each time. She had been right. She had known she was right. She had pushed back against the people who told her she wasn't, through every process available to her, and she had eventually, expensively, won. But winning had looked like a suspended badge, a formal hearing, a CMO's resignation, a doctor's career dismantled, whistleblower sitting in a corridor with his hands on his knees, waiting to find out whether doing the right thing was going to cost him everything. Winning had looked like 4 days of watching her husband not use the only tools he'd ever trusted, because she'd asked him not to. Winning had looked like Celeste Harrow's voice, saying Nurse Pembroke in a hearing room. Finally, for the record, saying the name of the person who had actually been there. It was a win. She was not going to pretend it was anything else. It was also the most complicated, costly, grinding win of her professional life, and she was not going to pretend that either. 6 months after the hearing, on a morning in autumn, Audrey walked out of Blackwood Medical Center after an overnight shift. It was early. The light was the specific thin gold of October at 6:45 a.m., coming between the buildings at the angle that only happened for about 20 minutes before the cities got too busy to notice it, slanting down the avenue and catching the edges of things and making ordinary surfaces look like they meant something. She was tired in the specific clean way of someone who has worked hard at something that mattered. She stopped on the sidewalk outside the entrance and tilted her head back for a moment, eyes closed, feeling the cold air and the specific relief of being outside after 12 hours inside. And she thought about nothing in particular, which was its own kind of luxury. You're going to let all the cold in. She opened her eyes. Grayson was standing 10 feet away, in a coat she recognized, holding 2 cups of coffee. No convoy, no escort, no particular arrangement of space around him that indicated he had people managing his presence. Just a man on a sidewalk outside a hospital at 6:45 in the morning, slightly unshaven with coffee. She walked toward him. He held out a cup. She took it. They stood there for a moment, side by side, watching the avenue do its early morning thing, the delivery trucks, the dog walkers, the people in scrubs coming and going, the city beginning its ordinary machinery of another day. "How was it?" he said. "Long good. There was a kid 14 years old, motorcycle accident. Not his motorcycle. Somebody else's. He had no idea what he was doing on it. He's going to be fine. She sipped the coffee. His mother cried for about 40 minutes. I let her? She looked at the street. Sometimes that's the whole job. Letting people feel it where it's safe. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said the attorney called yesterday. The federal timelines. Tell me later. She turned to look at him. Not right now. Right now I just want to stand here for a minute. He looked at her. He nodded. They stood. The October light came down the avenue and caught the edge of her hospital badge and the edge of her wedding ring and made them both briefly bright, which was not symbolic and not meaningful in any deliberate way. Just light doing what light does, finding the surfaces that reflect it. Still just a nurse, he said. She raised an eyebrow. Emergency nurse, she said, trauma certified. And I've told you that twice now. I know. The corner of his mouth. I like hearing you say it. She looked at him for a moment. At the man who had come back to her department with coffee and a real name, who had told her the truth about himself and waited to see what she did with it, who had sat in a courthouse and married her and addressed from a normal store, who had kept the part of he'd ever been asked to keep in a hearing room on a Thursday when everything was at stake. She looked at him, and she felt not the grand swelling thing that movies made of love, not the clean, untouched version, but the actual thing, complicated and expensive and real, tested in the specific way that only things that have been under pressure are ever really tested. And still there on the other side of all of it. Still there. Let's go home, she said. They walked. Not into a clean ending. Not into a version of things that had resolved itself neatly and laid itself to rest. Into the actual thing, the federal process still running its course. The hospital still navigating what Pharaoh's departure meant for its governance. Robert Cho still showing up every morning to a job that was quietly more complicated than it had been. The state licensing board still working through what to do with Celeste Harrow's file. All of it still in motion, still unresolved in the way that real things are still unresolved. Into that together, which was not the same as easy, which was not the same as safe, which was the specific thing that two people choose when they have looked at each other clearly, not at the best version, not at the managed version, but at the actual person, complicated and imperfect and real, and chosen anyway. The avenue opened up ahead of them. The city moved around them the way it always had, indifferent and constant, full of its own specific disaster and ordinary mornings, and people making decisions in the dark that would catch up with them later in the light. Audrey Pembroke walked through it with her hospital badge on her chest, and her ring on her finger, and her coffee in her hand, and the man she loved beside her, neither of them in front of the other, which was the only way it had ever worked, and the only way it was ever going to. The morning light held for a little while longer. Then the city got busy, and the light went the way light goes, and they disappeared into it the way everyone eventually disappears, not dramatically, not cleanly, just forward, just into whatever came next, carrying what they'd earned and what they'd lost, and the specific in what they'd lost, durable knowledge of people who have been through something real together and have come out the other side still standing, still honest, still there.